thank you very much for those remarks. From hearing you speak, it's clear that you when sort of thinking about the threat of China, that you look in many ways to Thatcher, Reagan, and some sort of the Cold War figures. What do you think are the similarities, and what do you think are the differences between the existential threat of China versus the existential threat Russia posed to the West during the Cold War?
Well, I wouldn't describe what is occurring now as a Cold War, and I don't think many would. The obvious difference is the integration between all of the Indo-Pacific economies with each other and throughout the rest of the world. So I think that is one fundamental difference. There is a high level of engagement. I mean, China is Australia's biggest trading partner. Now, the bulk of that is made up in resources as opposed to manufactured goods and things of that nature. But I think that is the key difference. So there is a form of economic interdependence, whereas during the time of the Cold War, there was a complete bifurcation.
Yeah, and given that economic interdependence and also sort of ecological interdependence we saw with the pandemic.
Sure.
Yeah, and if we're going to tackle some of these huge problems like climate change, presumably it relies on global cooperation. How do we both achieve that whilst also in a sort of foreign policy of bipolarity, which some would say security partnerships like AUKUS lean into the latter? How do you then deal with the larger problems?
Well, I think the security partnerships deal with the world as it is, not as you'd like it to be, and therefore are realistic. And then you seek to achieve the other levels of cooperation that can be achieved with the guardrails of those that security architecture being in place. And that is as true for China and Russia and Iran as it is for Australia, the United States, Japan and India and many others. The security arrangements should be taken as a given. But issues, as you say, such as climate, I think present an opportunity to extend beyond those. But it's hard, given that, as I said before, China now completely dominates and has for many years critical minerals processing. They effectively control the supply and the price and can move it up and down to suit what their other objectives might be. And we've seen, and I think a very sensible response through the CHIPS Act in the United States, where they will control the flow of semiconductor technology and the manufacturing capability to achieve that, which principally occurs in Taiwan and out of the United States on the design, but also with a lithography out of the Netherlands. So it is a very complex world. But where I'm optimistic, the climate change policies that we pursued believed that you had to focus on the technology to produce renewable energy technologies at a price that could be adopted in the developing world. I was constantly frustrated that when I would attend event after event after event, they thought the answer was politics. And it's not. The answer is hydrogen at $2 Australian a kilo. If you can achieve that, then the economies of Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, India, China can all embrace a very strong economic future and one with zero emissions. That's what we sought to do in the partnerships we had, particularly with Japan, who also had a very practical and positive agenda on reaching net zero. We both committed to doing that. I was the first Australian Prime Minister to commit to net zero by 2050. But that wasn't a statement of politics. It was a statement of confidence in what I thought entrepreneurial free market capitalism could achieve by focusing its efforts on producing the technology that led, for example, to the incredible semiconductor industry that we see in the world today. But at that same G7 meeting, I remember arguing to those assembled, if we could develop a vaccine for COVID in the space of less than a year, and congratulations to the UK, when at the start of that pandemic, no one even thought it was possible. That just tells you what can be achieved, particularly from our own societies. It was a very proud moment, I think, in the UK's history, but in the world's.
On that point, do you not think that the government can have a role in terms of, encouraging and setting the rate of change for this sort of development? For instance, with the development of the COVID vaccine, that was something the government did take a step in facilitating,
Sure.
put a lot of money towards. And so do governments not have a responsibility to take those sort of actions and buy more policies, I suppose, towards net zero and other things? Are incentives not created for then research to move in that direction?
No, I agree with that. And that's why my government had 20 billion invested in working with industry and our research community to develop such technologies. And we set them those targets. I mean, the targets that matter are the technology targets that you set, because if you don't hit those targets, then what you create is a great gap between when technology may appear at some point in time. And even worse, I mean, if you read Bill Gates' book on this, and I found that one of the most convincing about net zero by 2050, is he said, be careful in setting your early targets, because we all know how the innovation curve works. And if you pour resources into short-term gains in emissions reduction, that could be done at the expense of the capital investment required for the big breakthrough technology changes, which could take 10 to 20 years. But once you achieve them, you go off like a rocket. And then you get sustainable change to your economies that do not have to say to the developed world, sorry, you just have to miss out. And if you do have to miss out, then we'll pay you reparations, which seems to be what the political debate most recently in Egypt was at the most recent COP. It's about finding the answer, not the compensation for failing to find the solution.
You've mentioned COVID, and it was sort of one of the policies, I think, perhaps internationally, you're widely, recognised as taking sort of quite a defining stance on it. You made a very bold decision quite early on, perhaps without, the fullness of information about how the virus is spreading, etc. What are your reflections on that? How did you make that decision? And do you feel very confident it was the right decision to go into a sort of immense lockdown early on?
Well, the lockdowns occurred on a stage wave over February, March, April, and then particularly in the second wave, which were the most intense lockdowns. But the early phase, which was principally driven at the federal level, was when we shut our border to China. And I don't regret that for a second. I mean, Australia's response to COVID saved 30,000 lives. It saved over 1 million jobs. And it actually prevented, I just saw this figure the other day, I think it was 2.5 million Australians from going into poverty over the course of COVID. So what we did in COVID from the outset was understand that this was not just a biological pathogen that was going to risk the lives of tens of thousands. I mean, the first estimate we were given is that 50,000 Australians would die. That's more than were killed in action during the Second World War from Australians. I remember I was reading during the course of the pandemic Eric Larson's book, The Splendour and the Vile, about Churchill's first year. And when I was reading the numbers of how many were being lost during the Blitz, it struck me that more lives were being lost in the UK under COVID than during the Blitz, which was a staggering thing when you think about it. So, as you said, without all the information, well, nobody had all the information. I think that was the great challenge all leaders faced around the world, and why I was so critical of the lack of transparency out of China in the early phases of COVID. It's called COVID-19 for a reason. It didn't happen in 2020. It happened in 2019, and we still don't know how or where or why. But that first month, we needed more information, and it did not come, and we never did get the answers. And so we had to make calls based on the information we had. So yes, what we did is a combination of social restrictions that were scaled as the risk increased. but also a series of unprecedented economic measures, which meant Australia's economy came through the pandemic stronger than all the G7 and pretty much all of the OECD, because we made the investments in a targeted and timely way, delivering that support when Australians needed it to give them confidence.
And during this sort of period, you appointed yourself to a number of ministerial positions, something that the Labour government has sort of censored you for retrospectively. Do you think that that was a necessary step in order to safeguard the country, or do you think that more than the results of policy, the priority for government should be transparency?
Oh, well, I made a statement in the Parliament about this. There were a number. Two were misjudgments. The ones in Treasury and Home Affairs, they were misjudgments. But on the others, in relation to health and finance, no, they were the right calls, because we were dealing with responses that went well beyond anything the Australian government had ever done. And in both of those portfolios, in fact all of those portfolios, the decision-making authority did not rest in the Cabinet. It rested with one individual. And so one individual could spend billions of dollars without requiring any further authorisation of Cabinet or anyone else. And the same was true with the biosecurity powers that the Health Minister held, and the Health Minister was in full agreement that that should have been put in place as a backup. Because, I mean, we almost lost Boris here in the UK. I remember that time very, very well. Going to bed one night in Australia, not expecting to be alive when I woke up the next morning. And, you know, we'd been speaking relatively often, given the circumstances. And so it's very easy for those to look back after and say, well, this could have been done and that could have been done, and possibly so. But I simply point to the fact that everyone was doing everything they possibly could to save lives and livelihoods, and Australia did that better than any other country almost in the world.
And so you believe that. I think recently what's happening in the UK is we're looking into. There's an inquiry into our government's COVID response, and what a lot of people are upset about is just seeing, you know, the casual way decisions are being made on WhatsApp, even if those ended up being the right decisions. And so, do you think that at times due process can be flouted in order to achieve the results?
Well, I should stress that the decisions we took were all within the conventions and the law of Australia, and some changes have been made subsequently, which I support. But equally, when you're dealing with a time under incredible stress, our Cabinet, our National Security Committee was meeting constantly, and all those decisions were going through that National Security Committee, other than the ones that were devolved to particular ministers. I should stress that none of the authorities that I had to administer departments, I wasn't sworn in as a minister to any of those departments. There's a difference between that and being sworn to administer departments. They're two different things. None of those were exercised, thankfully, because it wasn't required. But no, our cabinet processes were followed, and they proved to be very robust in an environment where you had, in some cases, minutes to make significant decisions, because there was so much at stake and there were so many unknowns. It was the most demanding time Australia, and I'm sure most of the rest of the Western world faced, the whole world for that matter in some respects, but certainly the Western world faced since the Second World War.
All right, on that note, I think that's 50 minutes left. Let's turn over to questions from the audience. Let's go to the member in the pink shirt. And Franch, could you bring a microphone down? Thanks. So just wait for a second. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've launched a very robust defence of appointing yourself to administer government departments during COVID. But in your speech in your response to the Australian Parliament, you said the positions were simply sorry, I've forgotten the words. I'll just find them. You said that they were simply a dormant redundancy.
Correct.
In the middle of a pandemic, why were you appointing yourself to positions that, by your own admission, were dormant redundancies? And given you've talked so passionately about wanting to restrict power from one individual or a small group of individuals, how do you square that with taking the power over those decisions yourself?
Well, they were a dormant redundancy because it was a break class and case. And when you were dealing with COVID, you had to understand that you were working in a completely different world from what you'd known. And that meant that if something went wrong, then there could be very little time and you would need to act. And that's why I referred to it as a dormant redundancy. It would be activated if necessary. And thankfully, on the COVID-related matters, that was not required, and I was pleased that it wasn't required. But had it been required, and I had not done it, and decisions couldn't be taken, then I would have equally been condemned for not having taken precautions. So that's the environment you find yourself in when running a country in the middle of a great crisis. You make the calls that you think are in the nation's interests, and you do everything you can to protect your citizens. And that's what we did. And I make no apologies for that. That's what people were expecting me to do.
Yes, the member just there in the white. Yes, with the mask and the white shirt.
Thank you, Prime Minister. My question is, what kind of role do you think Japan should play in order to realize free and open Indo-Pacific? And why do you think Japan-Australia relationship has recently become such a very good one?
Oh, well, thank you for the question. Our view about the Indo-Pacific is inspired by the late Shinzo Abe, who was the most impressive leader I have ever met. He was an absolute champion of freedom and democracy and a champion for our region. And that inspired so many of the things that I've talked to you about today. And he was, I think, a mentor to many, including myself, about how those arrangements were brought together. Shinzo and I commenced the process of the reciprocal access agreement between Australia and Japan, the first one that Japan had ever entered into with any country. And Japan has become, I would argue, the most significant player in the Indo-Pacific in terms of like-minded countries. We share a common perspective on the region living in it. I refer to Japan and Australia as the spine of the Quad, from north to south, that looks in and is part of the Indo-Pacific and draws in our eastern and western colleagues in the United States and India, to look not just at the issues of defence and security, but issues of humanitarian objectives. We did a lot together to support developing countries through COVID, but also on the issues of economic development and a much broader agenda, which is what the Quad dialogue is all about. And Japan sits central to that. And we saw that again with Kishida-san recently at the G7, and the role that he played, I think, in pulling people around a common perspective on the issues that were challenging the world at this time. And so I see Japan as an enormously central player in global affairs. And Australia is fortunate to have, I would argue, the strongest relationship we've ever had with Japan. And there are so many points of substance to that. It's not just a handshake and a meeting and isn't it all lovely and wonderful. There are substantive measures on working from everything from technology on... I referred to critical minerals processing before. Australia is the biggest producer of lithium, but we don't process a lot. When I was in government, we invested over $1 billion to try and change that in Western Australia with the Iluka. But it was Japan who was our first big partner for the processing of critical minerals mined in Australia. And so whichever the topic is, the manufacturing of critical technologies, of renewable energy technologies and the industrialisation of those, Japan is sitting right out there in front. So it's hard to refer to them anything else as the most like-minded and like-spirited of partners these days.
The member just here on the front row, French.
I'm curious in terms of your personal interactions with Xi Jinping, your sense of him. Is he someone who really has just kind of been consumed or is by the kind of mechanisms of the Communist Party? Is he surrounded by yes men? Is he out of touch? Or does he kind of really believe a kind of more ardent return to kind of old school Maoist doctrine? And in terms of that, what does that mean in terms of the longevity of the CCP and the stability in terms of infighting in the next decade or so?
Well, thank you for the question. I met Xi Jinping personally on 2 occasions in private discussions in on and around the margins of APEC and the other one was the G20. But we also sat in a number of rooms together and I had observed him. He addressed our parliament back in 2014, which was the first time I met him. I think the answer rests heavily in one of the remarks you made right at the end. He is a true believer. He's an absolute true believer. He's an old-fashioned Marxist, and he's not making it up. He believes in China's destiny very much, and he believes in state-sector economies. He believes in state-owned enterprises and the collective agenda, all of the above. And that's why I find his assertiveness convincing, because he means it. And we've seen that before. And that's why I think he should be taken so seriously. And Xi Jinping has begun what I and others have called a third revolution in China. He is effectively, well, he's repudiated the Deng era reforms of China. Now, Deng is responsible for the greatest economic miracle in human history in the number of the millions, tens of millions he brought out of poverty. That is the single greatest economic achievement in world history. And what we see now is an unravelling of that approach. We also see Xi Jinping, I think, trying to redefine the culture. He is blending a heavily nationalist culture in China. And he's now trying to connect it with an historical reference around Confucianism, which was previously rejected by the communists in China. And now he's trying to connect it to a new understanding of what communism is in China, and particularly Xi-styled communism in China. So, he's got a very detailed, I think, and well thought through understanding about how he will set about what he wants to achieve. And that's why I think the West must take him so seriously. Now, there's nothing wrong with a country having and a leader having a great ambition for their nation, particularly the well-being of their citizens. But if you're living in Xinjiang, it's going to be hard to feel the love on that, I think. And in many other places, in Hong Kong and so on. China, I always felt, wanted to offer the West a deal, and everyone a deal basically, which was, we'll do business with you, we'll make you rich, just don't tell us what we can do and where we can do it in your country or in ours. It's not a deal that any self-respecting country that values freedom can take. And we certainly didn't. But to answer your question, I think he's a very serious individual who means exactly what he says.
Yes, let's go to the member on the front row. Yes.
One thing I just want to say, I can't stand up, it's not out of disrespect. I've noticed in our culture, a lot of us are quite scared of the threat of China. And especially with...
Sorry, I didn't...
Sorry.
The echo.
With the threat of China, and especially on a cyber level as well, I think...
Yep.
And again, I might be watching too many conspiracy theory reels on Instagram, but the whole thing of TikTok... Oh, sorry, I just kicked you. of TikTok being actually in partnership with the CCP. And basically, what I want to ask is, what do you think we can actually do as citizens and in terms of what we vote for and our actual politicians to actually counteract any possible threats from China?
It's at many, many levels, but I am encouraged, as I said in my remarks, that it is already happening. AUKUS had a halting effect in many respects on China's expectations about how things were going to play out. The sheer fact that the Anglosphere came together in the way at which it did with such intent, and that's a tribute both to the UK and the US, and I particularly have to acknowledge Boris Johnson. This would not have happened without his strong support when he and I took that proposal to the US. So I think there needs to be an understanding and an acceptance and appreciation for the reasons I've set out that these defence and security arrangements are very, very necessary. I don't believe China wants to find itself in a conflict any more than anyone here or in Australia or the US does. But I think the lessons of history tell us that the most effective way to avoid that is by having a credible deterrent, which means the calculus just doesn't add up to take that step, which I think is what Kissinger was trying to stress. And I think we have to heed that warning. Otherwise, you find yourself in the horrors of what we saw last century, and none of us wants to be there. So I think there needs to be an acceptance that the security, defence, partnerships, agreements, and the resources that are required to realise that are necessary for safety and for peace. Beyond that, I think there is also a need to integrate like-minded economies, both in critical technologies, in critical resource processing and rare earths, and ensuring, if they call it friendshoring, of much of the supplies. We particularly learnt during COVID just how complex these supply chains were. And I know for a fact that there were many countries that felt incredibly intimidated, that they could not speak up when it came, as we did, on the origins of COVID. They felt they couldn't because they would be locked out of essential medical supplies. And I thought that was an abominable situation for leaders to find themselves in. So I think the answer rests in have a strong and robust security arrangement, a realistic economic plan that understands that this is how the world is, and that involves trading with China. There's nothing wrong with that. We shouldn't stop doing that, but it just means in some areas, like we said, you can't come and build our 5G network. That's fair enough too. And I was pleased that the UK finally made the same decision, and others did as well. So there's an acceptance of that. But the third point I would say is this, and that was really my last point. By all means, let us understand the lessons of our own history, but let's not send the signal that we've given up and lost faith in Western society, because it is the hope of freedom around the world. That doesn't mean we have to run around the world changing regimes and forcing them to move to a different form. No, I don't think that's a good idea either. Let it be the result of the demonstration of polities like the UK or Australia's or others around the world demonstrate why they are such good models. That's effectively what Reagan's argument was, that the West understood freedom and those living in Soviet Russia wanted a taste of it.
Do we have time for one final question? And let's go to the member in a green shirt in the second row.
Thank you, Scott. In a slightly unrelated note to the rest of your talk, I'm just curious to ask if there's been any sort of noteworthy experiences in your life that occurred whilst a younger man drunk in a McDonald's?
You must have missed the tweet where the offender pointed out that was all a hoax. Never happened. It was a joke. When you dedicate your life to public service, these days you probably cop a lot more of that stuff than you used to. And my only suggestion to you is Australians can take a joke better than anyone else in the world. And I think one of the things that endears Australians, I would hope, is that we don't take ourselves so seriously and we can have a bit of a laugh at ourselves, which is fine. Hence, I'm not suing anyone and I'm not offended. It's just around not far from where me and my family live. But be careful to respect and appreciate your democracy and your institutions. Because without them, you wouldn't have this, what you celebrate in this very union. It just wouldn't exist. And it certainly won't be there for those who come after you, which was really my appeal to you in my speech. We can be very critical of those who've come before us, but the sacrifice they went through in the Second World War to give us a world order that has achieved more than I think even they could have hoped and dreamed for, I hope we can do as well as they did. We will have the same human faults, and we will make our own mistakes, but I certainly hope that's not one thing we will sacrifice and not leave to them. I'm quite optimistic about the future. I always am. Australians are like that. We're always optimistic, as difficult as things might get, because we understand that we can get there and we can make it work, provided we focus on what's most important. So by all means, have a laugh and a giggle and have a healthy access to politicians and leaders. And that's why in Australia, when I go to America, and the kind young gentleman here referred to me as Prime Minister, that's kind. I'm no longer the Prime Minister. We don't continue to keep those honorifics post-office. That's just how we are in Australia, and I'm very comfortable with that. It's the nature of our society. But don't forget how important that society is, and it's for you now to define it for the future.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison. Our dispatch boxes on which we continue to debate were given to us by Winston Churchill. So whenever we stand up to protect free speech, we always do it. So in memory of those great individuals who've come before us. But with that, please all join me in giving another round of applause to Scott Morrison.
Thank you.